In the autumn of 1961, on a gravel road outside of Milk River, Alberta, a 43-year-old woman named Harriet Vane paid $60 for a quarter section of cracked alkali flats that 3 different county assessors had already written off as unimprovable. The land was the problem. The previous owner, an old bachelor named Solberg, had spent 20 years trying to make it produce and had given up in 1958, moved to Lethbridge, and handed the title to his nephew in Medicine Hat, who had never once driven out to look at it. The nephew was an insurance adjuster. He had called the municipal office in Milk River and asked what the land might be worth. The clerk had been polite about it. Not much, she had said, not in its current state. The alkali had taken the south field completely. The north pasture had maybe 30% grass cover left. The creek that ran through the east corner went salt in July every year and stayed that way until October. Nobody in the county wanted it. When Harriet made her offer, the nephew accepted by telephone in under 4 minutes. Her husband, Robert, found out that evening. He came in from the shop, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and sat down at the table the way a man sits when he already suspects what he is about to hear. She told him. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. Harriet, we have 300 acres already. We have a mortgage on the equipment. We have 2 kids in school. I know what we have. That land is alkali waste. You could not give it away at the coffee shop. Someone just gave it away for $60. Robert looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he has been married to for 19 years and still does not fully understand. It was not an unkind look. It was a look of genuine puzzlement, the kind that comes not from disagreement, but from the sense that the other person is operating on information you do not have access to. What are you going to do with it? He finally asked. She told him she would explain when it was working. He did not say anything else. That night, he had learned by 1961 that there was a particular quality to Harriet's silences that meant the decision had already been made at a level below the one at which conversation operated, and that the most efficient response was to wait and watch. The story moved through Milk River, the way stories move in small towns, which is to say, it moved fast and lost nothing in translation. Harriet Vane bought the Solberg quarter, paid $60, going to try to do something with it. The details got better with each retelling. By the time the story reached the grain elevator, she had apparently planned to turn alkali flats into cropland. By the time it reached the Legion Hall on a Friday night, she was going to try to grow wheat on land that had not grown wheat since 1941. People were not unkind about it. They were entertained by it, the way rural people are entertained by ambition that seems to exceed its circumstances, the way you watch a calf try to clear a fence that is clearly 2 feet too high, half expecting to be wrong. Let me tell you about Harriet Vane, because what she did with that quarter section over the next 11 years only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she learned to see land the way she saw it. Harriet was born in 1918 on a mixed farm outside of Cardston in the foothills country west of Lethbridge, where the Rockies sit close enough on the horizon that you can read the weather coming 3 days out if you know what to look for. Her father, Gordon Ainsworth, ran a small herd of beef cattle, kept a market garden, and cut hay on the creek bottoms every summer with a horse-drawn mower he had bought secondhand in 1923 and maintained with a stubbornness that outlasted 3 separate offers to replace it. Gordon Ainsworth was not a complicated man, but he had one quality that set him apart from most of the farmers in that part of the country. He paid attention to water, not to rain, or not only to rain, to what happened after the rain, to where it went, how fast it moved, what it carried with it, where it stopped. He had grown up watching farms fail in the dry country south of Lethbridge during the 30s, farms that had good soil and adequate rainfall in the average year and still dried up and blew away because nobody had thought carefully about where the water went when it did come. Gordon had thought about it. He built berms on the low side of his fields that most people thought were ugly and unnecessary. He kept grass strips along the drainage runs when every agronomist in the district was telling farmers to break sod right to the fence line. He composted manure and worked it back into his fields in a county where most men considered that a waste of time you could spend doing something productive. His neighbors thought he was eccentric. His fields held moisture through dry spells that left the surrounding farms cracking. By the time the war ended, Gordon Ainsworth's farm was producing yields per acre that were quietly remarkable in a district where nobody talked about such things directly. You could see it from the road if you knew what you were looking for. Harriet was the one who knew what she was looking for. She was the middle child of 4, the only one who followed her father from field to field, asking questions he was willing to answer. By the time she was 12, she could look at a stretch of ground and tell you where the water would pool in spring, and where it would run off and where it would evaporate before it ever reached the root zone. She could read a field the way some people read faces, picking up small signals that added up to something her father could not always articulate, but recognized when she named it. She left the farm at 20 to train as a nurse in Calgary. She married Robert Vane in 1942, the year he came back from overseas, with a slight limp and a quietness that had not been there before. They moved to Milk River in 1948, when Robert took over his uncle's implement dealership, and Harriet spent the next decade raising their 2 children, working part-time at the clinic in town and reading every agricultural bulletin that the provincial government mailed to the district office, most of which nobody picked up. She had been watching the Solberg Quarter for 6 years before she bought it. What she saw when she looked at it was not what her neighbors saw. They saw alkali damage, which was real. They saw poor grass cover, which was also real. They saw the Salt Creek, which ran through the property like a boundary marker between useful land and useless land, and which had been writing off that east corner for as long as anyone could remember. What Harriet saw, underneath all of that, was a hydrology problem. The alkali had not come from nowhere. It had come from somewhere uphill, carried by water moving in a particular direction across a particular kind of subsoil, and deposited in the low places where the water slowed or pooled. The alkali was a symptom. The water movement was the cause. She had a theory about what could be done about it. She had been developing the theory since 1955, reading papers from the Federal Experimental Farm at Lethbridge, from research stations in Saskatchewan, from a small number of papers she had requested through the library in Calgary, from institutions in Utah and New Mexico that had been working on salt-affected rangeland rehabilitation since the 1940s. The literature was not extensive. It was not widely read in southern Alberta. Most of it described what could be done on salt-affected land if you were willing to work with the hydrology rather than against it. If you planted the right species in the right sequence, if you understood that rehabilitation was not a season's work but a decade's work, and if you had enough patience to let the land tell you when it was ready to accept the next step. Harriet had the patience. She had been practicing it for 6 years, looking at the Solberg Quarter from the road. The $60 purchase was not an impulse. It was the conclusion of a process that had been running for most of a decade. The land had become available, and the price confirmed that nobody else in the county had arrived at the same conclusion she had. She bought it the way her father used, to buy tools at farm auctions. Not because they were cheap, but because he understood what they were for, and nobody else in the room had figured it out yet. She started in the spring of 1962. Robert came with her on the first day, which she had not asked him to do and which he did not explain. He walked the ground with her for 4 hours, said almost nothing, and drove home in silence. That evening he told her he would help with the fencing and the earthwork if she told him what she needed. She told him. He wrote it down. He did not tell her what he thought the chances were, because he had decided by then that the question was irrelevant. Harriet had already decided, and Robert Vane had spent 19 years learning that Harriet's decisions were worth following even when he could not see where they were going. She did 3 things in the first year that the county agricultural rep, a young man named Ed Finlay, later told her he would have advised against if she had asked him first. She was glad she had not asked him first. The first thing she did was build a small earthen berm along the upper boundary of the alkali flat, diverting the seasonal runoff that had been carrying salt down from the clay subsoil on the neighboring section for at least 30 years. It was not complicated engineering. It was a low wall of compacted earth, maybe 2 feet high at its tallest, running along a contour line her father would have identified in 10 minutes. Robert dug it with the farm tractor in a long weekend in May. Ed Finlay came by and looked at it and said he hoped she knew what she was doing. She thanked him for stopping. The second thing she did was seed the alkali flat, not with grass but with 2 species that most farmers in the district considered weeds or at best irrelevant. She seeded kochia, which is salt-tolerant and grows readily in disturbed alkaline soil, and she seeded forage kochia, a variety developed at the Lethbridge Experimental Station, specifically for reclamation work on salt-affected range. Her neighbors, when they noticed what she had seeded, concluded that she had given up on the land entirely and was just trying to get anything, to grow on it, so it did not look completely abandoned. They were not wrong that she was trying to get something to grow. They were wrong about why. The third thing she did was fence the alkali flat, separately from the rest of the quarter, and put nothing on it. No cattle, no horses, no machinery beyond what was needed for seeding and the occasional inspection. She put up a gate with a chain and a padlock, which in Milk River in 1962 was the kind of thing you did to keep people out of something valuable, and which, in this context, struck people as either eccentric or aspirational, or possibly both. Her daughter, a 12-year-old named Peggy, who had her mother's habit of following and watching without demanding explanation, asked her one evening what she was waiting for. For the kochia to do its work, Harriet said. What work? She thought about how to explain it to a 12-year-old in a way that was accurate without being more complicated than it needed to be. The kochia pulls salt up through its roots, she said. When it dies back in the fall, and we work it into the soil, it takes some of the salt with it. Not all of it, some. We do that for a few years, and the soil changes. And then what? Then we see what wants to grow. Peggy thought about this for a moment, the way children think about things they find genuinely interesting rather than things they have been asked to understand. How long does that take? Harriet looked out at the flat, which in that late summer light was covered in a pale green flush of kochia that looked, she had to admit, more like a government experiment than a farm. Longer than people want to wait, she said. By the end of that first year, the Solberg Quarter had become something of a minor local curiosity. People drove past it, the way people drive past construction sites, not because they expected anything remarkable, but because it was something new in a landscape that did not change quickly. The berm was visible from the road. The kochia was visible from the road. The padlocked gate was particularly visible, and the conversations it generated at the coffee shop in town had a quality of fond exasperation that was not entirely without affection. Harriet Vane and her reclamation project. Have you seen what she's got growing on that flat? Kochia. A whole field of kochia. Like she's farming a municipal ditch. Ed Finlay had the good grace, years later, to tell this story on himself. Let me tell you about the years between 1962 and 1968, because this is where the work happened that nobody saw, which is most of the real work in most worthwhile things. The berm held through the first spring melt and redirected enough of the salt-laden runoff that the soil on the lower flat began to receive somewhat less of it than it had been receiving for the previous 30 years. Not none, some. The kochia grew. In October, Harriet worked it back into the soil with a light disc that Robert mounted on the farm tractor for the purpose. She reseeded in the spring. The second year's crop came up thicker. She worked it in again. The third year, she added a species called nuttall's saltbush to the seeding mix, a shrubby plant native to the drier parts of the prairies that tolerates alkaline conditions, provides ground cover through the winter, and has root structures that are useful for what agronomists now call bioremediation, and what Harriet called, in her own notes, letting the plant do the breaking. In 1965, she had the soil on the alkali flat tested. The results came back from the provincial lab in Lethbridge with a note from the technician asking whether she was sure she had submitted samples from the right location. The sodium levels had dropped measurably, not dramatically, measurably. The organic matter content had risen slightly. The pH was still high, but trending in a direction the technician described as unexpectedly favorable. She tested again in 1966. The trend continued. In 1967, she seeded a test strip of rough fescue and northern wheatgrass along the least alkaline edge of the flat. She did not tell anyone she was doing this. She had learned from watching her father that announcing experiments, before you know, the results is a good way to make people remember your failures more clearly than your successes. She drove out to the quarter every week through that summer and walked the test strip and looked at the grass. It took. Not everywhere, in patches. In the places where the soil had changed enough to support it, the native grass came in thin and tentative and real. That fall, Harriet Vane sat in her truck at the edge of the flat for a long time, looking at those patches of grass in a field that had been written off as unimprovable alkali waste 6 years before. She had not done anything that was not known. Every technique she had used was documented somewhere in the literature that sat in filing boxes in her basement. She had simply done what the literature described, in the sequence the literature suggested, in a place where everyone who looked at it saw a problem, and she had seen a process that the problem was interrupting. She did not tell anyone about the grass that fall. She went home and updated the notes she had been keeping since 1962, entered the soil test results and the grass establishment data, and closed the notebook. Robert noticed that she was quiet at dinner in a different way than usual. "The flat?" he asked. She nodded. He did not ask more than that. He had been watching her watch that quarter for 6 years, and he had learned to read her silences the way she had once taught him to read a field. In 1968, she seeded the entire flat with a mix of rough fescue, northern wheatgrass, and a small proportion of forage kochia to maintain some salt tolerance at the margins. She removed the padlocked gate. She drove up and down the fence line one more time, checked the berm, and went home. In the spring of 1969, She put 12 stocker cattle on the flat for the first time. She gave them 60 days and pulled them off before the grass could be set back. The cattle grazed as cattle graze, the way grass-fed animals have grazed semi-arid range since before anyone in Alberta was keeping records. The grass recovered. She put the cattle back for 45 days in the fall. The grass recovered again. Ed Finlay drove out that September. He stood at the fence for a while, looking at cattle, grazing land he had last seen as alkali flat. He was in his late 30s by then, no longer the young man who had come by in 1962 and hoped she knew what she was doing. He found her at the truck. "How?" he said. She told him about the berm, the kochia, the saltbush, the soil tests, the sequenced seeding, the 7 years without livestock. He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you read about this?" "Lethbridge Research Station. Some papers from Utah. A bulletin from the federal government that came out in 1957. She paused. "Most of it was available. Through the library if you asked for it." He looked at the flat again. The cattle were spread across it in the afternoon light, pulling at grass that had not been there in 1961. "I should have known about this," he said. "You were busy advising people who had asked you." He laughed, a little uncomfortably. "I would have told you it couldn't be done." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't ask." He told the story at the Extension Service office the following week. His colleagues were interested. 2 of them drove out to see the flat. An older July, one of them, an older agronomist who had been working the Alberta district for 25 years, walked the field and said almost nothing for an hour, and then told Harriet that she had done something that the Extension Service had been meaning to demonstrate and had never gotten around to. "You did our job," he said. "You had a lot of farmers to look after," she said. He took soil samples. He took photographs. He asked if she would be willing to let the research station document the project for a bulletin they were planning on salt-affected land rehabilitation in the prairies. She said yes. She gave them her notebooks, which contained 11 years of observations in a handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped and organized, in a way that a scientist would have recognized as methodical, without ever having been told to be. By 1970, Harriet Vane was running 60 stocker cattle on the rehabilitated flat and the surrounding improved pasture, a number that no one in the district would have believed possible on that quarter section in 1961. The soil tests showed sodium levels that had dropped to within the manageable range for native grass production. The organic matter was up. The water retention of the soil was measurably better than the surrounding non-alkali land that had been in continuous production. Her carrying capacity on a quarter section of land that had been worth $60 was now comparable to her neighbor's best pasture. She had spent approximately $300 on materials over 11 years. Most of the labor had been her own and Robert's, done in the hours that a family farm produces when you are willing to stop treating every hour as a cost and start treating some of them as an investment. The word moved through the district differently from the way it had moved in 1961. Not as entertainment this time, as information. Ranchers who drove past the Solberg quarter noticed that the pasture looked different from what they remembered, and some of them stopped and looked over the fence, and some of those asked Harriet to walk them through it. She was polite to everyone. She showed them the berm. She explained the sequencing. She mentioned the species she had used, and where they were available. She did not lecture. She let them look at the grass and draw their own conclusions. A few of them drew the right ones. Most did not, because there were decades of assumption operating in those men about what salt-affected land was, and what it was capable of, and whether the effort of rehabilitation made economic sense against simply writing the land off and paying the taxes on it. A week of conversation with Harriet Vane was not going to move that. What moved it was slower. Let me tell you about the summer of 1973, because this is where 11 years of quiet, patient work met something nobody in the district had seen coming, and most of the ranchers in the area spent that autumn trying to figure out how Harriet Vane had known. The spring of 1973 was dry across the southern prairies. The winter snowpack had been light. The Milk River ran low in May. The creek on the Vane property, which usually ran clear and cold until June, went thin and then went to a trickle by the end of April. The grass did not come on the way it should have. It came slow, thin at first, in patches that filled in late and sparse. By June, every rancher in the district was rationing water and moving cattle to whatever pasture had the most standing grass. By July, the situation was serious, in a way that serious people described carefully and other people described with the bluntness that comes from watching something you have worked for your whole life start to dry up and blow away. Rainfall in July was 40% of normal. August was drier. The Milk River hit levels not recorded since the late 30s. The pastures that had been pushed to capacity through the good years of the late 60s ran out of grass in August, and the cattle on them had to go somewhere or be sold into a market that was already softening from too much supply. People sold cattle that summer who did not want to sell cattle. They sold pairs and culls and young stock they had planned to keep. Prices dropped. By September, the coffee shop conversations had the tight, careful quality of people trying not to say out loud what they were thinking, which was that it was the start of something longer than one dry summer. Harriet did not sell a cow. She did not sell because she did not need to sell. The rehabilitated flat, which had spent 11 years building soil organic matter and root depth and moisture retention in ways that her neighbors' pastures had not, held water in its soil long after the surrounding land had gone dry at the surface. The grass did not die. It went dormant, the way native grass is supposed to go dormant in a dry year, pulling back into its root system and waiting. But the root system was there to pull back into. The soil was there to hold the moisture that the roots needed. The plant community on the flat was diverse enough that when the grasses went slow, the native forbs and the saltbush held the ground cover and kept the soil from cracking and losing what moisture remained. By August, her cattle were grazing forage on the rehabilitated flat that should not, by every conventional assessment of that land in 1961, have existed. They were grazing it steadily, without drama, the way cattle graze land that has been given time to become what it was supposed to be. Robert came out to the flat with her on a Thursday evening in the middle of August. The sky was the thin, pale blue of a drought sky, the kind of blue that looks wrong somehow, too washed out, too still. The cattle were spread across the flat in the late light. He stood there for a long time. 11 years, he finally said. More, she said. 6 years of watching before we bought it. He nodded slowly. He was thinking about the conversations at the implement dealer, where the men came in to talk while they waited for parts, and where the conversation that summer had the particular exhausted quality of people carrying something they had not expected to carry. He was thinking about what it felt like to have the answer 11 years before the question became urgent. You knew this was coming? Not 1973 specifically, she said. I knew it was coming. The country gets dry. It always gets dry. My father kept a weather log. So did his father. It gets dry every 8 to 12 years, and every generation is surprised by it. He looked at the cattle. Your father's log, he said. She had grown up reading it. 40 years of rainfall records, in handwriting that changed as her father aged. Notes on the pasture condition, on the creek levels, on the years when things were thin and the years when they were not. The log was in a drawer in the farmhouse in Cardston, where her sister now lived, but Harriet had read it enough times that she did not need to look at it to know what it said. "The dry years are in there," she said, "regular as anything." Robert nodded again. He was a man of moderate words, and he had used most of what he had. The District Extension Service published a bulletin in October of 1973 about the ranchers in the Milk River area, who had come through the dry summer with their herds intact. There were 4 of them. One had large hay reserves. One had access to an irrigation pivot that most people in the district could not afford. One had been stocked at below carrying capacity for years, which his neighbors had considered inefficient until August. And Harriet Vane had a rehabilitated alkali flat that produced native grass pasture on soil that held moisture through a dry summer, because 11 years of sequenced botanical work had changed the structure of the soil at a depth that a dry season could not reach. The journalist from the Lethbridge paper asked Harriet how she had done it. She said she had read some papers from the experimental farm in 1957. Then she asked him if he wanted coffee. "Let me tell you how it ended, because the ending is the part her father would have recognized. Harriet ran cattle on both properties until 1979. When she was 61, she handed the quarter section she had bought for $60 to her daughter, Peggy, who had been watching the project since she was 12 years old, and who understood the soil and the grass and the hydrology of that flat as well as anyone alive. Peggy had taken an agricultural degree at Lethbridge and had written her thesis partly on the botanical succession data from her mother's notebooks. The notebooks were cited in 2 federal research bulletins on salt-affected land rehabilitation. The soil on the flat was tested one final time in 1978 and was indistinguishable by standard lab measures from the native rangeland on the undisturbed sections to the north. $60. Alkali waste. 11 years of sequenced botanical work and 1 well-placed earthen berm. Peggy still runs cattle on that quarter today. The grass has never failed in a dry year the way the surrounding properties failed in 1973. The berm is still there. It is not dramatic. You would not know what you were looking at if someone did not tell you. In 1981, the Alberta Agricultural Society asked Harriet to speak at their annual meeting in Lethbridge. She was 63, retired, and had never spoken at anything larger than the Milk River Women's Institute. She almost said no. Peggy convinced her otherwise. She stood at the podium with 2 index cards. She read from them once, set them down, and spoke without referring to them again. "People have asked me since 1973 how I knew," she said. "That is the wrong question. The question is what any of us are looking at when we look at land we have decided is ruined." She paused, not for effect, because she was thinking. Alkali Flat is not ruined land. It is land where the water has been going to the wrong place for long enough that the plants have given up waiting for it to change. You redirect the water. You plant what will grow in the conditions that exist, not the conditions you want. You wait. The land does most of the work, if you will stop interfering with it. To let it. She looked out at the room, which was full of people who had spent their lives arguing with the land about what it was going to do. The Lethbridge Experimental Station published the technique in 1957. I read it in 1958. I applied it between 1962 and 1968. My neighbors lost a third of their grazing capacity in 1973. My flat did not lose a blade of grass. She paused again. That is not because I was clever. That is because I was willing to read something that had already been figured out by someone else. and to wait long enough for it to work, and to not require anyone else's permission or understanding before I started. She picked up her index cards and stepped back. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then, it was not. Ed Finlay was in the audience. He had been with the Extensions Service for 22 years by then. He had driven past the Solberg quarter more times than he could count. He had watched the kochia come in 1962, and the grass come in 1968, and the cattle come in 1969, and the dry summer of 1973 pass without taking anything from that flat that it could not grow back. He found her in the lobby afterward. "I owe you an apology," he said, from 1962. She shook her head. "You didn't know. I should have known. I was the extension agent." "You were busy with the people who asked for help," she said again. "I didn't ask." He looked at his shoes. He was the kind of man who could absorb a fair assessment of his own limitations without making it about wounded pride. "What do you see," he asked her, "when you look at a quarter section of alkali flat?" She thought about it for a moment. "I see where the water came from," she said, "and I see what would grow there if the water stopped." He nodded slowly. "In 1961, I saw a write-off." "In 1961, she said, most people did." He turned his hat in his hands. $60. "Yes, for land that's worth." She let him find the number himself. "Worth more than the section next to it," he said, "in a dry year." She said nothing. She did not need to say anything. The summer of 1973 had said it, and the grass on the flat was still saying it, and it would keep saying it in every dry year that came through that country. For as long as someone who understood what they were looking at was willing to listen. She went home to Milk River that evening and wrote the date in the weather log she had been keeping since 1962, the one she had started because her father kept one and his father before him, the one that now held 20 years of rainfall and soil observations and grass condition notes for 2 properties in the Milk River district. The log that Peggy had been adding to since 1974. "That is how it works," Harriet had told Ed Finlay. One drought. One piece of land someone decided was worthless. One woman who read something in 1957 and was still patient enough in 1973 to let it be true. $60 for a quarter section of alkali waste. The land nobody wanted on. The farm of the woman nobody understood until the summer of 1973 showed them what patience and a small earthen berm can do to country that everyone else had given up on.